I didn't know her, but I feel like I am her. We all have little girls in this neighborhood, and we should be protecting our kids. And I just wish I knew her. I wish I could have done something.
So to hear that this happened to a little girl in this beautiful neighborhood was devastating. And honestly, I had a hard time comprehending that that could happen down the street from where I raised my kids.
Missy Mogle knew she was going to die. She was barely 5 years old, and her small body bore quiet signs of what she had endured. The officer who entered the bedroom that morning would later say it was the first time in his career he had to step outside just to breathe. The scene spoke volumes, not through violence, but through silence, and the way her tiny fingers curled inward, as if bracing for something. But what stunned everyone wasn't just the neglect. It was how many adults had known something was wrong, and yet she had been left alone. The surveillance cameras in that house weren't there for security. They were there to document something much darker, something you wouldn't believe if it hadn't been captured on hours of video. And when investigators began reviewing the footage, even the most experienced among them struggled to watch. You'll hear later how many times this little girl asked for help, but by the time anyone really listened, it was too late to change the outcome. This isn't just a case of parental failure. It's a failure of every system designed to protect children. A child protection network that missed every flashing red light. A justice system that opened the door and handed her back to the people who would end her life. There were signs. There were reports. There were chances to save her. And each one was wasted. Her name was Missy. And this is not just her story. It's a warning. Because if a child can be lost despite being seen, heard, and reported, then no child is truly safe. A gentle but firm warning before we continue. This documentary involves a deeply troubling case of child neglect and systemic failure. While we will present it with care and avoid disturbing imagery, the subject matter may be emotionally difficult for some viewers. To our new viewers, thank you for joining us. Please consider subscribing and letting us know where you're watching from. It truly helps us understand and reach others who care about protecting vulnerable children. To our returning subscribers, those of you who have liked, shared, or commented on our videos, thank you. You are helping bring these untold stories into the light. Melissa Mogle was born on December 31st, 2019 in Florida. From the beginning, she was described as bright, expressive, and unusually empathetic for her age. But behind her early smiles was a family dynamic already strained. Her biological mother, Chloe Mogle, was just 17 at the time of Missy's birth. Unprepared for the demands of motherhood, Chloe left the day-to-day parenting to her own parents, Andy and Pepper Mogle, who lived in Wakulla County. They quickly became the child's primary caregivers. For nearly 4 years, Missy was raised in that home. It was her only stable environment. Her grandmother, Pepper, structured her routines. Her grandfather, Andy, prepared her favorite meals. She developed emotional bonds that helped her thrive. But while Missy was settling into childhood, her mother was drifting further away from it. In 2021, Chloe married Daniel Spencer, a man 12 years older with a history of volatility. Friends from Wakulla High School later said Chloe began changing after she met him. Once outgoing and connected to her family, she began isolating. Communication with her parents dropped off. Missy, once seen regularly at her grandparents' home, was now out of sight. Then in January 2024, a family court ruled that Chloe Mogle could formally resume custody of her daughter. It wasn't a case of legal rights being restored after removal, but rather a recognition of biological parental standing. From birth, Chloe had played a limited role in Missy's life, relying on her parents to raise the child. But after marrying Daniel Spencer and moving into a new home, she petitioned for full custody, claiming that her circumstances had stabilized. The court agreed. There was no formal objection filed by the grandparents and no prior legal termination of Chloe's rights. But what wasn't considered during the hearing would later prove critical. At the time of that custody transfer, Chloe's husband, Daniel Spencer, was out on bond from a recent arrest. He had been charged following a law enforcement operation, targeting individuals communicating with minors online. Despite this, the court placed no restrictions, conducted no home safety review, and did not formally evaluate Daniel's background before returning Missy to their care. No additional vetting was done. No follow-up inspections were scheduled. And without warning, Missy was taken from the only consistent environment she'd known and placed in a household already under scrutiny. In July 2024, a call was made to Florida's Child Protection Hotline. The caller reported a troubling claim, one that involved 5-year-old Missy and her stepfather, Daniel Spencer. According to official documents, Missy had spoken about behavior from Daniel that raised serious concerns. She was 5. Her words were simple, but the message was unmistakable. Daniel had a habit of touching Missy inappropriately. The Department of Children and Families launched a formal investigation. Law enforcement in Tallahassee was brought in. A case file was opened. Detectives documented Missy's statements. They made contact with the adults in the home. But within days, the momentum faded. By protocol, a home visit was conducted. Chloe Spencer, Missy's mother, told investigators that Daniel was no longer in contact with Missy. She claimed Missy had been moved to stay temporarily with a relative and assured them that supervision was in place. There were no visible injuries. No witnesses came forward. And Missy, due to her age, was not considered a strong enough source for legal action. The Tallahassee Police Department reviewed the case, but with no corroborating physical evidence, it was determined that the available information could not support charges. The DCF, in turn, closed the file. The report was marked as inconclusive. The case was shelved. But what made the outcome so critical was what it revealed about the structure of the system itself. There was no secondary review, no multi-agency coordination. The statement of a child, regardless of the risk it implied, was not enough to trigger emergency intervention. Daniel remained in the home. The case remained closed, and no monitoring or supervision was put in place. By the morning of May 19, 2025, Missy was quietly brought back to the house she should have never been returned to. At 7:44 a.m. on May 19, 2025, a call was placed to emergency services from a home in the Southwood community of Tallahassee. On the line was Daniel Spencer. Calm but measured, he told the dispatcher that 5-year-old Missy had become unresponsive. His explanation was brief. She had thrown what he called a tantrum, held her breath, and when he returned to check on her, she was no longer moving. He did not mention any fall, injury, or prior medical condition, just a breath-holding spell, followed by silence. According to Daniel, he had left the room intentionally. He said he believed she would calm herself down. When he returned minutes later and found her unresponsive, he claimed to have panicked and immediately called for help. Inside the home, as paramedics arrived, they found another adult already attempting resuscitation. That man was Robert Frabel, a member of the household and Daniel's relative. Frabel was performing CPR on Missy in the living room near the front entrance. Emergency medical technicians quickly took over. Missy was transported to Tallahassee Memorial Healthcare under full medical response protocol. Despite intervention efforts, she was passed away at 8:34 a.m. Police officers from the Tallahassee Police Department were dispatched to the residence as part of the protocol for any case involving an unresponsive child. Upon arrival, officers began documenting the scene. While the initial report described a breath-holding episode, investigators noted that the physical setting of the home did not align with the events as described. No immediate signs of medical emergency were visible in the areas Daniel referenced. Officers took photographs, began initial interviews, and most critically, collected several electronic items, including a digital storage card. That SD card had been used with an in-home recording system. When forensic investigators began reviewing the device, they discovered that a number of video files had been deleted just hours earlier. The deletion appeared intentional, not automatic. The files were time-stamped, and many of them coincided with the hours before the 911 call was made. The deletion attempt raised immediate red flags. Investigators requested expedited digital recovery. Within 24 hours, they began retrieving footage that would completely reframe the investigation. What had started as a call about an unresponsive child now pointed to something else, something far more deliberate. The recordings captured over several weeks provided a view into the private life of the household. The footage showed Missy in her bedroom, alone, isolated, and often in vulnerable positions. In some segments, she appeared to have her arms and legs restricted in ways that raised immediate concern. In others, she was seen lying motionless while objects were placed over her. Investigators flagged these clips as critical to understanding what had happened and why Daniel Spencer's initial account conflicted so sharply with the evidence. The presence of both adults was confirmed in the footage. Daniel Spencer appeared on multiple occasions. In one clip, he adjusted objects near the child's bed. In another, he stood silently over her without engaging or offering any visible care. His demeanor was distant, his actions methodical. Chloe Spencer also appeared in the recovered footage. In one clip, she entered the room while Missy remained curled up on the mattress. In her hand was an object later identified by police as a household shoe. Her posture, her position, and her proximity to the child were documented clearly. Neither adult reported any of this activity during their initial interviews with investigators. Digital analysts examined the footage frame by frame. The content aligned with recordings from the evening prior to the 911 call and the early morning hours of May 19th. Importantly, investigators confirmed the files had been intentionally erased shortly before emergency responders were contacted. The autopsy report, completed days later, added further clarity. Medical staff noted indicators across multiple areas of the body, marks in various stages of healing, signs of prolonged nutritional neglect, and physical impressions consistent with repeated pressure. The medical examiner did not cite a single fatal cause, but concluded that the condition was consistent with sustained harm over a period of time. These findings, taken together, digital, physical, and behavioral, formed a picture that no longer resembled a medical emergency. It resembled a timeline, one that built slowly, silently, and without intervention, until it could no longer be ignored. On May 27, 2025, just over a week after the 911 call that prompted the initial investigation, formal charges were filed against both Daniel Spencer and Chloe Mogle. The charges came from the state attorney's office in Florida's Second Judicial Circuit, following an evidence-led review involving law enforcement, digital forensic specialists, and prosecutors. Each individual was charged with 4 felony offenses: second-degree murder, aggravated battery involving a minor, gross neglect, and failure to report endangerment. These charges pointed not to a single incident, but to a pattern of risk and oversight that authorities believed had gone unaddressed for far too long. The court ruled that neither Daniel nor Chloe would be released on bond. This decision was especially significant in Daniel Spencer's case. At the time of the incident, he was already under court supervision for a previous conviction stemming from an unrelated online sting. In that case, he had entered a guilty plea in April 2025, but sentencing had not yet occurred. Despite that status, he had remained in the home, a detail that would later draw public scrutiny. State Attorney Jack Campbell held a press briefing the day the charges were announced. He stated that, based on the timeline, had Daniel Spencer been in custody following his earlier conviction, the outcome of the May 19th emergency call might have been different. While careful not to speculate, Campbell's remarks underscored a broader concern. When supervision fails, consequences can follow. Following their arrest, both defendants were placed in separate detention facilities with strict conditions. They were prohibited from contacting one another, from engaging with witnesses, and from having access to minors, including their own children. The court ordered additional reviews before trial proceedings could begin. Chloe Mogle's initial hearing was scheduled for July 9th. Daniel Spencer's case management hearing was set for August 7th. Until those dates, some elements of the case remained sealed to protect sensitive material still under review. What began as a local investigation had now entered the courtroom, where the focus would shift from what had happened to how it was allowed to happen and what the system will do next. In the weeks that followed, the community surrounding Missy Mogle began to respond. What had started as a quiet case in the Southwood area of Tallahassee was no longer confined to courtrooms and legal briefings. It had begun to spread through neighborhoods, schools, and local congregations, places where people were asking the same question: how did this happen? 2 public memorials were held to honor her memory. The first took place at the Southwood Community Center, just a short distance from the home where Missy had lived. Dozens of residents gathered, parents, teachers, neighbors, all wearing pink and purple, her favorite colors. Children drew butterflies in chalk along the sidewalks. Soap bubbles were released into the air. There were no speeches, just quiet reflection. The second event was held at Pioneer Baptist Church in Crawfordville, the town where Missy had spent her early years with her grandparents. Organized by Jasmine Hartsfield, her godmother, and supported by community leaders. The gathering was intended as a tribute, but it quickly became a moment of resolve. A petition was launched in the days after. Its aim was focused: to strengthen review procedures before placing children in homes where adults have prior legal concerns involving minors. The proposal called for more consistent background checks, closer coordination between state agencies, and accountability in custody decisions. Within days, the petition had gathered hundreds of signatures. No official policy changes had been enacted at that point, but multiple agencies began internal reviews. Meetings were scheduled, files were reopened. Behind the scenes, institutions were asking themselves whether the system had done enough, and what would be required to make sure it never failed in the same way again. What happened in this case wasn't a single failure. It was a pattern: missed signs, delayed action, and systems that didn't speak to each other. Missy's story revealed what was missing long before the crisis came, and that makes what happens next even more important. Prevention starts early. It begins with courts that take every concern seriously, with schools trained to notice the subtle signs, and with communities that stay alert, even when nothing looks obviously wrong. There are steps that matter. First, agencies must share what they know. When systems don't connect, risks get lost. This case made that clear. Second, professionals need the tools to understand young voices. A child may not say it perfectly, but they often say enough if someone's listening. Third, caregivers play a key role. Keep records, dates, comments, small details. They all matter when it's time to step forward. Fourth, help kids know who they can trust. Make safety a conversation, not a reaction. And finally, don't wait for a crisis to bring action. Host awareness nights. Encourage parent training. Bring these conversations into schools before the headlines arrive. This case was not simply about what went wrong. It was about multiple points where the safety net was too thin or missing altogether. And unless reforms are made, the risks remain. Missy's life reflected the potential every child carries. Her story can still serve a purpose. It can change how we listen, it can reshape how we act, and it can drive a wider culture of protection before crisis takes root. If you believe stories like this matter, help us share them. Each share could lead someone to speak up and also raise awareness. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Join others committed to building a safer, more responsive system for children everywhere. In memory of Missy, a child whose voice deserves to be heard long after the silence.
The district attorney called their alleged crime an American horror story. And today, a mother and her boyfriend had the first of many court appearances to come in connection with the killing of young Scott McMillian. It is Thursday night, and the big story on Action News is the first hearing tied to the murder of a 3-year-old boy that shocked people in Chester County and throughout our area.
The defendants in the case were not physically in court today, but there were plenty of activists present who were calling for justice.
I'm so sorry, Scotty. I tried to protect you, but now you're gone. And that monster is still breathing.
The handwriting was shaky, each letter pressed into the paper like it carried the weight of a lifetime. The writer wasn't an adult. He was just a boy, barely old enough to tie his own shoes. But he had seen more pain than most people do in an entire lifetime. His little brother, the one who used to follow him everywhere, was dead. And he had been there for every second leading up to it. What happened inside that Pennsylvania trailer wasn't just abuse. It was methodical, relentless, and unthinkably cruel. The kind of horror you'd expect to hear about in a courtroom, not a child's memory. They say it lasted 3 weeks, but the silence that followed, it's lasted 10 years. The adults in that house didn't just fail him. They laughed, they watched, and then they left while he lay motionless on the floor. They went shopping, they ordered pizza, they even had time to sleep, and when they finally called for help, they already knew it was too late.
The trio of suspects are being held in, quote, isolation in the Chester County prison these days. So heinous are their alleged crimes against a child. The wheels of justice do indeed grind on in the case of Scotty McMillian.
But how does something like this happen in modern America when there were warning signs? When the school noticed? When neighbors had questions? How does a child vanish in plain sight? and no one stops it. We're about to take you inside one of the most haunting child abuse cases in recent memory. Not to dwell on the horror, but to uncover how it happened, why no one intervened, and what it will take to make sure it never happens again. Warning: this documentary contains content related to child abuse and may be upsetting to some viewers. We present this story with deep care and respect for the victims. Viewer discretion is advised. To our returning subscribers, thank you. Because of you, this channel continues to grow and shine light on stories that demand to be told. Every like, comment, and share helps amplify the voices of those who can no longer speak for themselves. If you're new here, welcome to Disturbing True Crime Documentaries. Let us know where you're watching from. We see every name and every location. And if this story matters to you even a little, tap that subscribe button, because awareness saves lives. And what you're about to hear, it matters more than ever.
At this tiny district courthouse in rural Chester County, Gary Lee Fillenbaum and his live-in girlfriend Jillian Tate waived their preliminary hearings in the murder case of Tate's 3-year-old son Scott. He died November 4th, the prosecutor says, from systematic torture, allegedly administered in their rented trailer, with punches to the face and stomach, scourges with a homemade whip, lashes with a metal rod, bound to a chair and beaten, then tied upside down by the feet and beaten some more.
Scott McMillian was born on January 26, 2011 in Chester County, Pennsylvania. From the moment he arrived, his presence left an imprint on those around him. With striking red hair, bright blue eyes, and a soft, curious demeanor, Scotty stood out, not just for how he looked, but for the way he made others feel. Those who knew him remember a little boy full of imagination. He loved trains, especially anything from the Thomas the Tank Engine series. He'd hum quietly in the back seat during car rides, often singing to himself or to the rhythm of whatever was playing on the radio. He liked to draw, build small towns out of toy cars, and follow his older brother Ryan wherever he went. He didn't speak much, but he didn't have to. His affection was obvious in the way he clung to the people he trusted. Scotty lived most of his early life with his mother, Jillian Tate. The family's structure was already under stress. His father, Lauren McMillian, had been in and out of the picture since Scotty was born. Though the couple shared 2 children, Scotty and his older brother Ryan, their relationship had always been unstable. Arguments, separations, and extended periods of disconnect were common. Eventually, the divide became permanent. After the final breakup, Lauren relocated to Overland Park, Kansas. From that point forward, his physical presence in his sons' lives was limited. Sources close to the family say that contact was sparse and visits were nearly non-existent. Scotty, still too young to understand the layers behind adult decisions, simply began adjusting to a new version of life, one without a father around. Jillian, meanwhile, remained in Chester County and did her best to provide. She was young, juggling work and parenting, and relied heavily on her immediate family for support. 2 key figures stepped in: Aunt Kim, Jillian's sister, and Aunt Tara, Lauren's sister. Despite the tension between the children's parents, both women cared deeply for the boys and often helped fill in the gaps where they could. Aunt Kim, who lived nearby, became a familiar, stabilizing presence. She picked Scotty up from the hospital after he was born. She spent time with him, drove him around, and often gave him a safe space when his mother needed help. Aunt Tara, on the other hand, was based farther away but stayed involved, checking in, visiting when she could, and making sure the boys still had a sense of family on their father's side. Scotty bonded with both of them, and for a time, he had a small circle of adults who looked out for him. Those early years, before things changed, were filled with glimpses of a childhood that could have been. There are memories of birthday parties, Halloween costumes, and photos with messy faces after eating cake. Moments that in hindsight felt like the calm before something unthinkable. Moments that would later be dissected for signs no one saw. What's clear is that Scotty wasn't born into isolation. He was surrounded by people who loved him, who tried to support him, and who wanted to see him thrive. But the cracks that had started in his family's foundation would only widen, and into that space, left by absence, instability, and distraction, someone else would soon step in. No one knew it yet, but the absence of a father would soon be filled by someone far more dangerous. In early October 2014, Gillian Tate made a decision that would change everything. She moved herself and her two sons, Ryan and Scotty, into a trailer in Westcount Township. The move wasn't random. Gillian had recently begun a relationship with a man named Gary Fellenbaum, a co-worker she'd met at Walmart. Gary was 23 years old at the time. He worked alongside Gillian in a low-wage position at the same store. Outwardly, he seemed stable, quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but functional. What Gillian may not have known, or chose not to question, was that Gary was still legally married. His wife, Amber, and their infant daughter were also living in the same trailer. Gary had told Gillian that his marriage was effectively over. He claimed they were in the process of separating and only continued living together because Amber had nowhere else to go. Whether Gillian fully believed him or simply accepted the situation out of necessity is still unclear. What is clear, however, is that she agreed to move in, bringing her children into a shared space already strained by unresolved tension. The trailer was small. With 2 women, 2 children, and an infant all under one roof, it quickly became crowded and unstable. According to court documents and later interviews, the household was marked by stress, unspoken resentment, and long-standing dysfunction. Despite the tension, no one left, and no one reported the growing discomfort inside the home. Gillian's family members began to notice subtle changes. Her communication became less frequent. She stopped returning calls. Her once open social media presence grew quiet. Those close to her, particularly her sister Kim and Ryan and Scotty's paternal aunt Tara, grew uneasy, but without proof that anything was wrong. And with Gillian legally in control of her children, there was little they could do beyond expressing concern. Financial strain likely played a role in Gillian's choices. She had been raising 2 boys mostly on her own, with minimal support from the children's father. Moving in with someone who could help split expenses may have seemed like the only viable option at the time. But it came at a cost that would later prove irreversible. Almost immediately after the move, Scotty and Ryan were pulled out of school. No forwarding address was provided. No formal withdrawal paperwork was completed. Teachers and staff at the Coatesville Area School District noted their sudden absence. Gillian never explained the move to school staff. She didn't notify friends. She didn't leave a trace. To the outside world, she had simply gone quiet. What no one knew then was that the change in address wasn't just about location. It was the beginning of an environment that would soon spiral into one of the most alarming failures of protection in recent memory. If you've made it this far, you already know, sometimes the most dangerous shifts happen in silence. Subscribe to help us keep shedding light on the warning signs others missed. By late October 2014, something unusual had caught the attention of staff at the Coatesville Area School District. 2 brothers, Ryan and Scotty McMillian, had stopped showing up for class. At first, it seemed like a routine absence. Maybe they were sick, maybe the family had moved. But the days continued to pass. First 1 week, then 2, and still no one had heard anything. Following internal policy, the school sent a formal letter to the last known address. When that received no response, a staff member conducted a home visit. The door went unanswered. A note was left behind. And then, nothing. No report was filed with Child Welfare Services. No additional attempts were made to verify the children's whereabouts. There was no documented conversation with neighbors, no escalation. The file remained open, but stagnant. On paper, it was just another unresolved truancy case. What the school didn't know was that Gillian Tate had already removed both children from that address weeks earlier. She had moved in with her new partner, Gary Fellenbaum, in a different township. No notice had been provided. No records were transferred. And no one, not friends, family, nor the school, was told where the boys had gone. Without a forwarding address or official enrollment request, the district classified the case as a presumed withdrawal. In the absence of a confirmed abuse report or visible signs of harm, the school had no legal grounds to initiate further action. In a system already stretched thin, the file was effectively closed without ever being formally resolved. In hindsight, this was the first institutional silence that allowed what followed to remain hidden. 2 children disappeared from their learning environment, and the only line of inquiry, school administration, hit a wall after one attempt. No one alerted local authorities, no one cross-checked with medical providers or social services. The school did what it was permitted to do, but no one went beyond that. This is where the breakdown began. A single missed opportunity to investigate further. A moment when a deeper look might have revealed more than just a change in address. At the time, there was no way for school officials to know what kind of household the children had entered. No system linked the withdrawal to a new risk assessment. There were no alerts, no red flags, just 2 missing names from the attendance sheet. Inside that gap between procedure and protection, the boys slipped out of sight. And with no one pushing for answers, the danger that had already begun to surround them continued without interruption. The adults at school saw the silence, but no one knocked twice. In the final 3 weeks of Scotty McMillian's life, what unfolded inside that trailer in West Calne Township wasn't an isolated outburst. It wasn't impulsive or reactionary. It was patterned, repetitive, and above all, it was sustained. According to testimony in court records, the climate inside the home shifted significantly during this time. Tension rose between the adults and the children, especially Scotty, were caught in the middle. Behavioral expectations became more rigid. Mistakes, even minor ones, were met with harsh consequences. There were no second chances, no explanations, just reactions that steadily escalated in intensity. One recurring issue, documented during later investigations, involved Scotty's mealtimes. Court statements revealed that his inability or unwillingness to eat, particularly during breakfast, was interpreted by the adults in the home as a sign of defiance. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply wouldn't finish his food. And for that, he was labeled difficult. Instead of asking why a 3-year-old was struggling with basic eating, the adults in charge resorted to correction methods that would be called into question during court proceedings. These actions weren't once or twice. They were repeated across multiple days, with increasing pressure each time he hesitated at the table. When Scotty refused to eat, especially during breakfast, his hesitation was treated as a deliberate act of defiance. The response wasn't concern. It was punishment. According to court testimony, he was forced to sit for long periods while being pressured to finish his food. When that didn't work, the adults escalated their response, especially Gary. Scotty was reportedly tied to a chair using household items like tape, unable to move, and left in that position as a form of discipline. At times, he was kept in isolation, separated from his brother, removed from normal routines, and left without basic comforts. These actions weren't isolated. They happened over multiple days. Each time he resisted, the consequences intensified. No one in the home contacted a doctor. No one reported it. And the more he struggled, the more they blamed him for it. What makes this period especially alarming is how many people were physically present, yet remained silent. Amber Fellenbaum, Gary's wife, later admitted that she saw what was happening. In interviews with investigators, she said she noticed when Scotty was being isolated from the rest of the household. She witnessed behavioral punishments and the clear imbalance in how the 2 boys were treated. But she didn't step in. Her explanation was fear. Fear of confrontation. Fear of what might happen if she interfered. She said she was intimidated by Gary and felt trapped in her circumstances. Whether that was true or an attempt to deflect blame is still debated. But the outcome was the same. No action was taken. During this entire 3-week window, no one contacted law enforcement. No one reached out to school officials. No calls were made to medical professionals. Even when it was apparent that Scotty was becoming more withdrawn, less verbal, and physically unwell, there were no reports filed. The silence wasn't just from the adults inside the trailer. It extended outward. The system, already disconnected from the boys due to their removal from school, had no eyes on the situation. Day after day, Scotty was separated from his brother. He was kept in his room for long periods of time. Punishments for minor behaviors became routine. There were no visits from family, no check-ins from school, nothing to disrupt the rhythm that had taken over the household. This wasn't a moment of rage, it was a pattern of control, enforced day after day, right in front of others. And with every passing hour, that pattern grew more severe, while the rest of the world remained unaware. November 4th, 2014 began with Scotty McMillian struggling to sit upright for breakfast. According to court records, his face was already visibly swollen. The day before, he had refused food. On this morning, he tried again, unsuccessfully. He attempted to eat, but kept spitting it out. That simple act, his body rejecting food, set off a chain reaction inside the trailer. Gary Fellenbaum reportedly saw this as disrespect. He became angry, walked over to Scotty, and struck him, first in the face, then in the abdomen. The force caused Scotty to fall from his chair. But that wasn't the end of it. Instead of helping the 3-year-old to his feet, Gary picked him up and placed him back in the chair. Then, using electrical tape, he bound him in place. What happened next was described in detail by Jillian Tate during later interviews. As Scotty squirmed, still unable to eat and now restrained, Gary struck him again. This time, the impact caused him to vomit. Moments later, he lost consciousness. At this point, Jillian and Gary reportedly attempted to revive him, not by calling 911, but by placing him in a cold shower. They left him there, hoping he would come to. They waited roughly 30 minutes. When that didn't work, they moved him to a partially deflated air mattress on the floor. No blankets, no pillow, just the plastic shell of the mattress. And then, according to both defendants, they left the house. They went shopping. They bought pizza. By the time they returned, Scotty hadn't moved. Rather than call for help, Jillian said she decided to rest. She lay down and took a nap. It wasn't until around 7:30 p.m. that she woke up and checked on Scotty. Still motionless, still silent. Only then was 911 called. When emergency responders arrived, they found a child with no signs of life. His body showed clear evidence of prolonged trauma, fresh marks alongside older ones. There were abrasions, contusions, and injuries that experts would later testify had developed over time. His condition was not the result of a single moment, but a sustained campaign of harm that had built up over days and weeks. The EMTs performed CPR and transported him to the hospital. But it was too late. Scotty was pronounced deceased shortly after arrival. Investigators later said that even among seasoned professionals, the condition he was in was unlike anything they'd seen in years. The timeline, the silence, and the decisions made in that household defied explanation. And what came next would only confirm the full depth of what this case had become. But the phone call investigators received next changed everything. The call came just hours after Scotty had been pronounced dead at the hospital. A nurse, shaken by what she had witnessed in the emergency room, placed a call directly to law enforcement, not just to report the condition of the child, but to raise immediate concern about the circumstances that brought him there. According to the nurse, Scotty's injuries weren't consistent with any kind of isolated incident. They suggested a pattern, one that had gone on for far too long without anyone stepping in. What concerned her most was the calm demeanor of the adults who had brought him in. Their accounts didn't line up with the evidence in front of her, and she felt that someone needed to act immediately. That call triggered an urgent response from investigators at the Chester County Detectives Unit. Within hours, law enforcement had arrived at the trailer on Hope Lane. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. The home was in disarray. Conditions inside the trailer were poor, unkept, chaotic, and unsettling. Detectives found signs of neglect, makeshift items that raised serious questions, and a chilling absence of anything that indicated basic childcare. But more importantly, they discovered that Scotty had not been living in isolation. He had been surrounded by adults, 3 of them, and no one had called for help until it was far too late. District Attorney Tom Hogan held a press conference shortly afterward. His tone was controlled, but the gravity in his words was unmistakable. This was not a moment of anger. This was sustained, it was repeated, and it was ignored. They watched a child die slowly over days and did nothing. Within hours, formal charges were filed. Gary Fellenbaum, 23 years old at the time, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, third-degree murder, multiple counts of aggravated assault, and endangering the welfare of a child. His role in what investigators now considered a prolonged campaign of cruelty placed him at the center of the prosecution's case. Jillian Tate, Scotty's mother, was also arrested. She faced charges of third-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, and child endangerment. Prosecutors stated that while she may not have delivered the most direct harm, she allowed it to happen. She stayed silent. She failed to protect her son. Amber Fellenbaum, Gary's wife, who was also living in the trailer at the time, was charged with child endangerment. She had not participated in the direct harm, but she admitted to seeing signs. She witnessed the isolation, heard the cries, saw Scotty's condition, and did nothing. Bail for Gary and Jillian was denied. They were held without the possibility of release. Amber's bail was set at $500,000.
Fellenbaum's estranged wife, Amber, who also lived in the trailer, faces charges related to watching the deadly abuse but waiting too long to contact the police. None of the three actually appeared in court today. They appeared on closed-circuit TV from the county prison.
There are two aggravating factors here, the first of which is the age of the victim. He was only 3 years old. And the second is torture.
For the district attorney's office, this case was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a statement, a line drawn in the sand. Prosecutors made it clear, this wasn't a case about a single moment. It was about a failure that had unfolded over days in plain view of people who should have acted and chose not to. With the arrests made and the charges filed, the investigation shifted to its next phase, piecing together how this happened, how it continued, and how a child could vanish inside his own home, while three adults stood by and watched. The courtroom proceedings for Scotty McMillian's case stretched over several years, shaped by complex charges, plea agreements, and a community still searching for answers. Prosecutors moved forward with confidence, armed with statements, forensic evidence, and testimony from witnesses inside the home. But the emotional weight of the case never lessened. In April 2017, Jillian Tate appeared before a judge and entered a guilty plea. She admitted to third-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. As part of the plea agreement, the prosecution agreed to drop the possibility of capital punishment in exchange for her full cooperation. She would no longer be required to testify against her former partner, because he too would soon accept responsibility. Jillian was sentenced to a minimum of 42 years in prison. Depending on parole eligibility and state guidelines, she could serve as many as 94. In court, she expressed regret, offering no excuse for her choices. Prosecutors noted her cooperation but made it clear that her failure to act had irreparably altered the course of her son's life. 5 months later, in September 2017, Gary Fellenbaum appeared before the same court. Facing overwhelming evidence, including statements from both Jillian and Amber, he chose to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. The charges included first- and third-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple counts of endangering the welfare of a child. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gary showed little visible emotion as the sentence was handed down. Amber Fellenbaum's case was handled separately. She pled guilty to child endangerment based on her admission that she witnessed signs of harm but did not alert authorities. In 2017, she was sentenced to serve between 6 and 16 years in prison. She began her sentence shortly after Gary and Jillian's convictions. By early 2023, Amber was paroled. During the sentencing hearings, the most powerful words came from someone who wasn't a prosecutor, a detective, or a judge. They came from Ryan, Scotty's older brother. In a letter written during therapy and later read aloud in court, Ryan spoke of what it was like to live in that trailer. He wrote of fear, of feeling invisible, of watching what was happening and being unable to stop it. His words described a childhood interrupted, not just by grief, but by confusion and betrayal. The letter carried the voice of a survivor still struggling to understand why no one helped sooner. As the court closed this chapter, one truth remained. Not all wounds leave a mark that can be seen. Sometimes the deepest damage lives quietly, carried forward by the people left behind. In the aftermath of the trial, Ryan was placed in the care of his paternal aunt, Tara, and her husband. The court approved the adoption. The same boy who had lived through 3 weeks of fear and loss now had a new home, one focused on stability and healing. Soon after Scotty's case made headlines, community members began sending in donations, letters, checks, and contributions to help Ryan rebuild his life. In response, a trust fund was established in his name. On paper, the gesture was generous, but in practice, the restrictions placed on the fund would lead to growing frustration.
A trust fund has been set up for Scott McMillian's surviving brother, 6-year-old Ryan. So far, officials say $25,000 has been raised.
The trust, as it was written, could only be used for Ryan's future college education. It did not cover mental health services, therapy, or general support expenses. That decision, made by the fund's legal custodians, led to widespread public concern. Many of those who donated had believed the money would go toward helping Ryan recover in the present, not just invest in his future. Ryan's adoptive family reportedly attempted to request changes to the terms, citing the boy's needs, medical appointments, therapy sessions, and other services critical to his well-being. But those efforts were denied. The fund remained locked for years, accumulating interest, but inaccessible to the very child it was meant to serve. Despite this, Ryan's new guardians ensured he received the care he needed. With support from extended family and nonprofit organizations, he began therapy and returned to school. Over time, he started to engage more with his new environment, though the emotional scars would take much longer to address. At the state level, Scotty's case sparked media coverage, brief political commentary, and temporary calls for reform. But no sweeping policy changes followed. There were no mandatory tracking updates for children suddenly pulled from school. No new oversight legislation passed through the state assembly. What did change, at least in the short term, was awareness. News reports, op-eds, and advocacy organizations pointed to the silence surrounding Scotty's disappearance and asked one question: how can a child be removed from their classroom, vanish from public record, and still fall through every safety net? In that silence, Ryan had survived, but the cost was immeasurable. What do you think? Should a child's healing have to wait for college? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share this video to make sure voices like Ryan's aren't forgotten. Because protecting children means acting when it matters, not years later. Scotty McMillian never appeared on a watch list. There were no flagged reports in a state database. No social worker ever made it through the front door. And by the time authorities arrived, the child they were supposed to protect had already been failed. At the core of this case is a haunting question. How does a young child disappear from school, home, and community oversight without setting off alarms? When Scotty and his older brother Ryan were suddenly pulled out of school, no one was informed where they had gone. A letter was sent. One home visit was made, but that was where the trail stopped. Despite repeated absences and unresponsiveness, no formal report was filed with Child Welfare Services. In this case, no one escalated the concern. No flag was raised high enough for intervention to take place. There was no record of a single visit from the Department of Human Services. No inquiry. No follow-up. Mandatory reporting laws exist to ensure that certain adults, teachers, administrators, medical professionals have a legal duty to report when something feels off. But without visible injuries or clear allegations, many tread cautiously. And in Scotty's case, that caution created silence. Relatives later said they sensed something wasn't right. Aunt Kim, who had cared for the boys in the past, expressed concern over Jillian's distancing behavior. Aunt Tara also recalled long gaps without contact. But extended family, under state law, had no legal power to intervene unless abuse had already been confirmed. Suspicion alone wasn't enough. There was no coordinated system connecting school withdrawal to social services. No policy that triggered an automatic welfare check when a child disappeared from class without explanation. That administrative gap allowed the situation to evolve unchecked. The adults surrounding Scotty, neighbors, teachers, even family, were not uncaring. They were unarmed. Without the tools or authority to act, they were left on the sidelines of a crisis they couldn't see in full. And the cost of that institutional silence? Permanent. This wasn't just neglect, it was a systemic failure. A sequence of overlooked signals that stretched across multiple agencies and individuals. Everyone did a part of their job, but no one connected the pieces. It's a reminder that danger doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it grows in quiet corners, masked by routine explanations and misplaced trust. Child mistreatment isn't always visible. That's why vigilance and shared responsibility are everything. Scotty's story is not only heartbreaking, it was avoidable. There were no locked doors, no remote location. He lived in a home surrounded by adults, and still no one intervened in time. That should make us all stop and ask why. If a child suddenly disappears from school, it matters. If someone starts withdrawing from relatives, it matters. If a caregiver seems evasive, that matters too. These aren't just small things, they're early warnings. Subtle signs that can save a life if we're willing to act. You don't need all the facts to ask a question. You don't need permission to speak up. Scotty didn't get a second chance, but others can. Share this video, speak up, and subscribe, because the next child might be counting on someone like you to notice.
Not necessarily for sure that she didn't know what was going to happen, and was willing to accept that a long time ago. It's an emotional trial, and because of the victim, the victim was a 2-year-old child, and that was hard to set aside and simply stick to the facts, but I think we did that.
She called out, "I love you," and still, no one stopped. There were no sirens, no frantic neighbors, no missing child alert flashing across screens, just silence. Days later, a fisherman noticed something drifting in Galveston Bay, a blue plastic container sealed tight. As he approached, he saw a small shoe pressed against the side. It was still blinking, a light-up sneaker glowing faintly underwater. Inside was the body of a little girl, unidentified, unclaimed, unseen. Investigators gave her a name, Baby Grace. But what stunned them wasn't just what they found, it was what they didn't. No school enrollment, no medical records, no family searching. In the system, she simply didn't exist. And yet, hundreds of miles away, one person was still looking. A grandmother who never stopped searching forums, scrolling headlines, hoping to see a familiar smile. One day, she did. Not by name, not by location, but by the shape of her little face, reconstructed by a forensic artist broadcast across the country. This is the true story of how a child was erased, not just from her home, but from every institution meant to protect her, and how one memory, one sketch, and one woman's persistence gave her back her name. Hello and welcome. If you're new here, please know this story is difficult but necessary. We share these cases not to sensationalize, but to raise awareness and prevent future harm. If you believe every child deserves to be seen, heard, and remembered, please subscribe. And to our returning viewers, thank you. Your shares, your comments, your voice help ensure these children are never forgotten. Let us know where you're watching from. You're part of something important. Riley Ann Sawyers was born on March 11, 2005, in the quiet suburb of Mentor, Ohio. From the moment she arrived, she was light. A small, golden-haired girl with big, curious eyes and a smile that rarely faded. She wasn't the kind of child you could ignore. Even at just a few months old, she drew people in. Her early years were shaped by complexity. Her parents, Kimberly Dawn Traynor and Robert Thomas Sawyers, were both teenagers when she was born. Their relationship was unstable. Young, still figuring out who they were, they struggled to create a home that could meet the needs of a child. That gap, however, was quickly filled by someone else, Riley's paternal grandmother, Cheryl Sawyers. Cheryl became more than a grandparent. She was Riley's anchor. In Cheryl's home, Riley blossomed. She had a place where routines were simple and love was steady. It was here she learned how to giggle at cartoons, how to dance when no one was watching, how to pretend an empty cardboard box was anything her imagination needed it to be. Riley loved stories. She would crawl into Cheryl's lap with a picture book and plead for the same tales to be read over and over again. Her favorite? Finding Nemo. She didn't just watch it. She studied it. Her eyes would light up when Dory appeared on screen. Cheryl remembered how Riley would sit completely still when that blue fish spoke, and then break into claps and laughter the moment the music started. But Riley didn't just observe the world around her. She wanted to take part in it. At just 2 years old, she had a habit of pulling a chair up next to her grandmother in the kitchen and offering to help. Most times, helping meant stirring batter that didn't need to be stirred, or spreading flour everywhere but the bowl. Cheryl never minded. For her, those moments mattered. Riley was developing fast. Her speech had taken off. She had moved from babbles to full sentences with startling clarity. She was stubborn, as many toddlers are. If she wanted something, she let you know. But there was no malice in her defiance, just personality. She had a spark, and people noticed it. Despite the challenges in her parents' relationship, Cheryl tried to keep stability in Riley's life. She created an environment where the child felt safe, where each day followed a rhythm. Meals, baths, stories, sleep. Riley thrived on that structure. At home, Riley gravitated toward music. She had her own. As soon as any melody came through the radio or TV, she'd start to sway or clap, as if her body already knew how to interpret sound. That joy wasn't taught. It came naturally. She also had favorites. Her plush toys, her books, the spoon she insisted on using even when it didn't match the rest of the set. Among those toys was a stuffed clownfish from Finding Nemo, worn at the edges from Love. That toy often sat with her during meals, sometimes during naps, and always nearby at bedtime. Her laugh was quick, high-pitched, and contagious. Cheryl would later recall that when Riley laughed, it was impossible not to smile. There are no perfect children, but Riley was loved, deeply, and she gave that love back just as easily. To Cheryl, she wasn't just a granddaughter. She was a daily presence, a routine, a bond. And then one day, that presence was no longer there. No more early mornings with sticky fingers reaching for pancakes. No more afternoons with Riley seated on the floor, flipping through her favorite books upside down just because she liked the pictures better that way. The transition was abrupt. But Cheryl couldn't have known that the normal, joyful chaos of toddler life, half-formed sentences, flour-splattered kitchen counters, and light-up sneakers on the wrong feet was slipping out of her reach. Because in Riley's world, everything seemed fine, until it wasn't. She was just starting to talk in full sentences, Cheryl would later say. And her laugh, it was contagious. That laugh, bright, unfiltered, unashamed, would soon be silenced. And no one knew it yet. Not the neighbors, not the local agencies, not even Cheryl. At this point, Riley wasn't just a child living in the world. She was becoming someone in it, making her mark in small, meaningful ways. And while no one could predict what was coming next, the signs were beginning to fade into the background. Moments that once felt ordinary would soon become everything. In early 2007, Kimberly Dawn Traynor was still a teenager when she began spending long hours online. Juggling early adulthood with the responsibilities of a young child, she turned to digital spaces for connection and escape. That's where she met Royce Clyde Ziegler Jr. inside a World of Warcraft forum. What began as casual conversation quickly became more personal. Royce, 8 years older, offered attention and consistency, two things Kimberly lacked. Their chats moved from the game to private messages, then to calls. The connection intensified. Within weeks, it wasn't just an online relationship. It was a plan. In May 2007, Kimberly left Ohio, taking her 2-year-old daughter with her to Spring, Texas, to live with Royce. There was no formal arrangement, no custody hearing. Just a quiet departure. Cheryl Sawyers, Riley's grandmother and closest guardian, pleaded with Kimberly not to take the child. Cheryl had cared for Riley daily, understood her habits, her fears, her personality. But Kimberly was determined, and once she arrived in Texas, everything changed. Royce's expectations were immediate. Riley, still in toddlerhood, was now expected to speak to him with formal respect. Yes, sir? No, ma'am? Politeness wasn't encouraged, it was required. There was no adjustment period. Royce set the tone, and Kimberly followed. On June 1st, 2007, Barely a month after meeting in person, Royce and Kimberly were married. A quiet ceremony, no celebration, just paperwork and commitment. From that point, the environment inside the home began to shift. Riley, no longer surrounded by the familiarity of her grandmother's house, was now being held to expectations far beyond her age. Royce framed her actions not as those of a developing child, but as behavior needing correction. He introduced rules, routines, and consequences. A handwritten document titled Rules for Riley was later found during the investigation. In it, Royce outlined how Riley was expected to behave, how she should speak, when she could speak, and how to respond when spoken to. It read more like a performance standard than a parenting guide. Kimberly, by all available accounts, did not resist this approach. Whether out of belief, dependency, or fear, she aligned with Royce's expectations. There were no external checks, no school officials, no social workers, no doctor's visits raising red flags. Riley had been taken from a stable home and placed into a world where structure was emphasized over sensitivity, and no one was watching closely enough to see the shift. Riley was adapting to a new home, a new father figure, and a new set of rules, all at once. In Royce's eyes, this wasn't a child needing guidance. This was someone who had to conform. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and deeply removed from the care a toddler would typically receive. And the most dangerous part, from the outside there was no alarm. Riley had been moved from one environment to another without any institutional oversight. Her voice, once vibrant and expressive, was beginning to fade behind walls that were closing in, and no one yet understood how far that silence would reach. By mid-2007, the Ziegler-Trainer household in Spring, Texas was marked by silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes from structure that overpowers spontaneity. Royce Ziegler brought with him a deeply rigid view of discipline. A man shaped by an upbringing he once described as strict for survival, Royce believed children should conform early or face consequences. He kept a handwritten list titled Rules for Riley, which detailed how the 2-year-old should speak, respond, and behave at all times. It wasn't guidance, it was compliance. Kimberly, still barely out of her teens, admitted she went along with Royce's rules to avoid conflict. She didn't challenge his methods, she didn't ask questions. Whether out of dependence or fear, she reinforced the same expectations. To outsiders, it seemed like privacy, but inside, Riley's world had narrowed. There were no play dates, no daycare, no visits to the doctor. She wasn't enrolled in any early education programs. She was learning, but only under Royce's gaze. Neighbors saw little. Co-workers heard Royce make comments about discipline that felt old school, but few questioned them. There were no calls, no alerts, no systems in place to flag concern. Every day that passed without intervention made Riley more invisible to the outside world. And inside that home, her voice, the one that used to sing, laugh, and ask for stories, began to fade under the weight of expectation. The warning signs were quiet, but they were there. July 24th, 2007. Inside the quiet house in Spring, Texas, morning began like any other. But this was the last day Riley Ann Sawyers would be seen alive. Riley woke late. Her eyes were still adjusting, her words slow. For most 2-year-olds, that would be ordinary, but in this home, governed by rules and punishments, it triggered something else. According to court testimony, Royce Ziegler became agitated almost immediately. Riley didn't answer quickly enough. Her delay, just a few moments, was taken as disobedience. Royce believed in structure. He expected complete obedience, even from a toddler. Kimberly would later tell investigators that Royce insisted Riley be placed in a cold bath as a form of punishment. Kimberly admitted she complied. The water was intentionally unwelcoming, a tactic Royce believed would drive obedience. During that bath, Kimberly reported that Royce repeatedly forced Riley to stay under the water for extended moments, each time lasting close to a minute. Riley, barely 2 years old, stood confused. The kind of confusion a toddler feels when something familiar suddenly turns uncomfortable. She looked toward the adults in the room, those she still relied on for safety, and whispered softly, "I love you." That single phrase, innocent and small, hung in the air. Kimberly stated that immediately after, Royce lifted Riley from the tub. What happened in the seconds that followed she described as sudden and violent. She said Royce became physically aggressive and Riley struck a hard surface with significant force. Kimberly claimed she froze, stunned by what had just happened. Later, during the forensic examination, experts reported that Riley's injuries were not superficial. They identified multiple fractures to her skull. The severity was compared by professionals to trauma someone might sustain from falling multiple stories, an impact far beyond what could occur in daily household mishaps. This wasn't something accidental or incidental, it was trauma caused by force. Authorities would later confirm that this event was the pivotal moment. Riley at that point fell silent. Kimberly said they waited. Minutes passed. They didn't call for help. Instead, they spoke in low tones about what to do next. That decision, to remain silent, to delay, to avoid, became as critical as the event itself. For hours, Riley remained unresponsive and presumed dead. The environment inside the home grew more calculated. The panic wasn't outward. It was quiet, deliberate, and focused on concealment. Later that same day, Royce and Kimberly drove to Walmart. Surveillance footage showed them purchasing a large plastic container along with cleaning products. At checkout, they appeared calm, collected. That evening, Riley's absence wasn't noticed by any neighbors or officials. No one knocked, no one asked questions, but that silence wouldn't last forever. October 29, 2007. The waters of Galveston Bay were calm. That morning, a local fisherman spotted something unusual near the shoreline, an out-of-place storage container. It was weathered, sealed, and partially wedged into the sand. What caught his eye wasn't just the box, it was what was faintly visible inside. A child's sneaker. Still blinking. He didn't investigate further. Instead, he contacted authorities. When officers arrived, they noted that the container had been closed securely and appeared to have been placed intentionally. Inside was the body of a young child. No identification, no immediate clues, and no active missing persons report that matched. Investigators gave her a name, Baby Grace. It quickly became apparent that this was not a case of a lost child. Everything about the condition of the container and its contents suggested planning. Forensics indicated that the child had been inside for several weeks, possibly 2 months, before being discovered. There were no records, no alerts, no institutional links that could help identify her. But investigators had one critical piece to work with: a pair of light-up shoes. Still functional, still flashing. They hoped the shoes, along with other personal details, would be enough to trigger recognition. With no confirmed identity, the Galveston County Sheriff's Office reached out to Lois Gibson, one of the nation's most experienced forensic artists. Using detailed anatomical references and tissue data, she created a full facial reconstruction of the child. The sketch was published through media channels across the country. It depicted a girl, approximately 2 or 3 years old, with soft features and light-colored hair. She became known nationally as Baby Grace, a symbol of loss, but also of a question left unanswered. Who was she? As the image spread, tips began to flow in. Dozens of calls, then hundreds. Some thought she resembled a niece, a former neighbor, a distant student. Investigators worked through each lead, but nothing matched. No identity could be confirmed. Behind the scenes, a team at the Galveston County Medical Examiner's Office was still working. The forensic examination uncovered signs of trauma, injuries that were not consistent with an accident. The findings suggested a pattern of significant force. According to official statements, the level of trauma was compared to that of a high-impact fall, something that could not have happened in the course of normal play. There were also indicators of other stress-related injuries. The results ruled out natural causes. The circumstances surrounding the child's condition pointed to one conclusion: what had happened was not incidental. To those leading the investigation, the findings were clear. This wasn't simply a case of disappearance. It was something else, something that had been concealed and kept quiet. But despite the weight of what had been discovered, one thing remained out of reach: her name. And yet, hundreds of miles away, someone was watching the media coverage. A grandmother in Ohio, scanning through headlines and television reports, saw the sketch created by Lois Gibson. She stopped, looked again, and recognized the face immediately. Not because of the context, not because of the location, but because she had once held that face in her arms. That realization would soon spark a break in the case. But at this point in the investigation, the authorities had only a drawing, a few pieces of clothing, and a blinking light inside a shoe. Still, one thing was certain. This child had not been forgotten by everyone, and someone, somewhere, was about to come forward. November 21, 2007, just 3 weeks after Riley's identity was confirmed, investigators made their move. Kimberly Trenner and Royce Ziegler were taken into custody at their home in Spring, Texas. During questioning, Kimberly initially claimed that Riley had been removed by a government agency. She produced paperwork she said supported that claim. But when authorities contacted officials in both Ohio and Texas, there were no files, no reports, no official record at all. The explanation unraveled quickly. Faced with mounting evidence, Kimberly admitted Riley was no longer in the home. She described the situation as discipline that escalated. Her statements shifted multiple times, but throughout, she suggested that Royce was the one who had set the expectations for how Riley should behave. Royce's statements, by contrast, were less direct. He claimed he hadn't been home when anything occurred. That Kimberly acted on her own. But the information collected by investigators contradicted that. That same day, just hours after Kimberly's arrest, emergency responders were called to the Ziegler residence. Royce had reportedly taken a combination of substances in an apparent attempt to take his own life and avoid facing the situation. He was found conscious but in need of immediate medical assistance. He was transported to a hospital for care. At the scene, officers recovered a handwritten note. In it, Royce took full accountability. He wrote that Kimberly had only done what she was told, that the decisions were his, and that he did not want her to be held responsible. Once he recovered and was transferred into custody, however, Royce's story changed. In formal interviews, he distanced himself from the events. He stated that he wasn't involved, that he came home after the fact, and that Kimberly alone had made the decisions that led to Riley no longer being in the home. But the facts didn't align with that version. Surveillance footage showed Royce and Kimberly together at a local store shortly after the events in question. Receipts from that visit matched items relevant to the investigation. Cell tower records placed both of them at the home throughout the day. Kimberly's statements and Royce's own note pointed to involvement, not absence. Two individuals. Two conflicting timelines. One child whose voice had been silenced. At its core, the case became about more than what had occurred. It became about clarity, about which version would withstand the facts, and about holding those involved responsible, not just for what was done, but for what was concealed. The courtroom sat still on the morning of February 2, 2009, as Kimberly Dawn Traynor appeared before the jury. It had been nearly 2 years since the child known to the world as Baby Grace was found near the shoreline of Galveston Bay. Now the faceless child was known, and so was the person standing trial. Kimberly faced charges of capital murder. The prosecution began by laying out a timeline, connecting her actions before, during, and after the incident. They argued that what happened to Riley wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a series of decisions that removed the safeguards a child depends on. Kimberly's defense offered a different version. They said the outcome was never intended, that it stemmed from parenting that escalated, not premeditation. Her attorneys pointed to her age, her inexperience, and the influence of her partner, Royce Ziegler. They framed her as someone who was overwhelmed and misdirected. But the prosecution didn't focus on age or emotion. They focused on facts. Throughout the trial, they presented interviews, handwritten notes, and audio from Kimberly's statements after her arrest.
With everyone waiting and expecting a long wait, it actually took the jury less than 2 hours to find Kimberly Trenner guilty of murdering her 2-year-old daughter, Riley Ann Sawyers.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Kimberly Dawn Trenner, also known as Kimberly Dawn Ziegler, guilty of capital murder.
With nearly everyone in the courtroom, even the bailiff, in tears, Kimberly Trenner sat as she has throughout the trial without showing any emotion as she was found guilty of murdering her daughter.
In one segment played for the jury, Kimberly described what had happened in her own words. She also explained how she and Royce attempted to shift attention away from the situation using documents that, upon review, were confirmed to be false. Investigators testified about those documents, forms Kimberly had shown to support her claim that Riley had been removed from the home by officials. That narrative unraveled quickly. There were no records to back it up. No agency had intervened. The story was fabricated. Medical experts testified about the forensic findings, detailing that what occurred could not be explained as a simple household accident. It reflected something far more severe, involving multiple actions taken over time. Still, Kimberly's defense maintained that she had not intended to cause irreversible harm. They stressed that she was reacting to pressure from Royce, that she believed his structure was helpful, even if it later became clear it wasn't. But when the jury weighed all of it, the shifting stories, the lack of transparency, the evidence of planning, the outcome was decisive. After just 6 hours of deliberation, Kimberly Trenner was found guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Less than a year later, on November 6, 2009, Royce Ziegler stood trial for the same charge. Unlike Kimberly, Royce claimed he hadn't been involved, that he arrived home and found the situation already unfolding, that the decisions made had been Kimberly's alone. But the prosecution introduced a different set of facts. They shared timelines built from receipts, interviews, and surveillance video. They played excerpts from Royce's recorded statements and examined a written message he left at home the day Kimberly was arrested. In that note, Royce claimed responsibility. He stated that Kimberly had only done what she was told, and that he should be held accountable. His defense team worked to minimize the impact of that message. They described it as a reaction made in stress, but the jury was shown how Royce participated in actions after the fact, how he helped acquire items used during the concealment, how he avoided contact with authorities, and how his story changed multiple times during questioning. In the end, the outcome was the same. Royce Ziegler was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole. There were no dramatic scenes in the courtroom, no final confessions, just two people, each now held fully accountable for their role in a case that shocked a nation. And for the jurors who listened to weeks of testimony, the conclusion was unmistakable. The jurors didn't need long to decide. It was that clear.
At the very beginning, we didn't know who she was. Now we do, and now we can never forget her.
We made a promise that day at the medical examiner's office that we will find the people who was responsible for her death, and we would bring them to justice. And that's exactly what we did.
I think for Cheryl it's difficult. She looked at Kimberly as a daughter, and she found it absolutely incomprehensible that Kimberly would be responsible in something like this.
Justice has been served today, and we look forward to presenting the next case when that day comes.
In January 2008, just months after authorities confirmed Riley Ann Sawyers' identity, her ashes were released to her paternal grandmother, Cheryl Sawyers, the woman who had never stopped searching. Cheryl brought Riley back to Mentor, Ohio, the place where her laughter once echoed in living rooms and where bedtime stories were part of the nightly rhythm. There, she laid Riley to rest beside her great-grandparents in a family plot that had long represented peace and continuity. The burial site was modest but deeply personal, a return to the place where Riley's life had truly begun. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Galveston, Texas, something remarkable happened. The quiet spot along the shoreline where a fisherman had found that sealed container months earlier was given a new name, not by the state but by the community. They began calling it Riley's Island. The name didn't appear on maps or in official records, but it didn't need to. Locals adopted it in conversation, in memorial events, and in how they remembered the space. For them, it was no longer just a point on the bay, it was a reminder, a statement, that the silence surrounding one child's story would never go unnoticed again. In both Ohio and Texas, tributes followed. Candlelight vigils were held. Online forums filled with messages of sympathy, frustration, and resolve. Her image, once circulated as a forensic reconstruction, was now accompanied by her real name, her real story, and a wave of people across the country, most of whom had never met her, made sure she wouldn't be forgotten. But the impact didn't stop at remembrance. Child welfare agencies in Texas began conducting internal reviews. The central question was clear. How had Riley slipped through the cracks? How had a child become invisible to every formal system built to ensure her well-being? That question sparked a broader dialogue, one that extended beyond Riley's case. Advocacy groups, legal experts, and concerned citizens began calling for policy improvements. Among their most urgent recommendations, transparent custody tracking, a system where movement between guardians, especially across state lines, is recorded and easily verified. Public school and daycare enrollment alerts. If a child of age isn't enrolled anywhere and no record explains why, it should prompt immediate outreach, not years later. Emergency communication channels. A way for relatives, neighbors, or concerned individuals to flag potential issues even when no formal report has been filed. Something that doesn't require evidence, just a reason to ask the right questions. In the wake of media attention, Riley's story became part of training modules for child advocacy organizations. Her name was cited in policy roundtables, community forums, and even state legislative briefings. What began as an anonymous mystery transformed into a case study for reform. Not because of the headlines, but because her story revealed what silence can hide and what vigilance can prevent. Today, Riley's Island stands as more than a place. It's a symbol, a reminder that awareness saves lives, that asking hard questions matters, and that even when systems fail, people like Cheryl, like the Galveston community, like you watching this, can carry the memory forward. Every share of Riley's story is a step toward change. If you've made it this far, comment for Riley and help us keep her memory alive. She said it softly, "I love you." Not in fear, not in panic, just a gentle phrase, the way a child speaks when they still believe someone will answer. Those were Riley's last known words. And after that, silence. For weeks, the world didn't know her name. She became a face on a flyer, a nickname assigned by investigators. Her story nearly lost beneath the weight of unanswered questions, but Riley wasn't forgotten, because one woman never gave up. Cheryl Sawyers, Riley's paternal grandmother, held on to hope through silence. When officials had no leads, she searched. When images surfaced of an unidentified child, she studied them, line by line, feature by feature. Something about that reconstruction struck a chord. Cheryl knew it. She felt it. And when she submitted photographs of her granddaughter to authorities, the truth finally came into focus. That moment didn't just restore a name, it brought Riley back into the conversation. Because of Cheryl, the story didn't end in mystery, it continued with answers. Because of Riley, the conversation about protection, oversight, and accountability reached new urgency. We've said it before, but it bears repeating. This was not just a story about one child. It's a lesson about what happens when systems fall short and what can happen when just one person refuses to stay quiet. A grandmother with resolve, a community that chose not to forget, and viewers like you who are listening, remembering, and standing watch. We can't change what Riley went through, but we can choose to carry her story forward, to recognize the quiet signs, to speak when something feels wrong, to ensure that no child is ever allowed to disappear without someone asking, "Where is she?" Let this be the legacy Riley leaves behind. Not just sorrow, but change. Please like, share, and subscribe. Let Riley's story be the reason we never ignore the quiet ones again. Because when a child says, "I love you," someone should always be there to hear it.